Previously on TrueAnon, Il Polpo.
Unfortunately, this story has ruined my life.
This sort of unsolved murder of this Italian journalist and our cameraman in the 90s.
Sometimes I think that podcasts are actually one of the worst ways in human history to convey complex information.
Somalia had been used as a dumping ground for hazardous waste since at least the early 90s. And anyone who goes looking all mysteriously turn up dead.
Okay, so my first question is, so Somalia is in Africa?
A 32-year-old Italian journalist and her cameraman,
Potentially at the center of an illegal weapons and waste trafficking line.
a burst of gunshot fire, but miraculously, the hired driver and bodyguard are unharmed.
Warlords, arm brokers, European firms, British bank, stay-behind intelligence operations, the mafia and the CIA.
Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, a.k.a. the Mad Mullah.
Liz's favorites, the Portuguese.
And then Ethiopia is left independent, which annoys the Italians.
We've heard you've got some 12-year-old boys there.
It's a complicated situation.
We're going to talk about the Italians for like 10 fucking more hours.
The Soviets get too frustrated and just end up pulling out completely.
Mussolini is like, fuck that.
It's hard for me to take something seriously when you name naval boats Stromboli.
I'm about to teach you guys some discipline.
Distractums, right?
Every country had a little shirt, and then they ran out of colors, and it got
very confusing.
It got very difficult.
Kind of a boondoggle.
We're sending your ass to Africa.
This mission did not go well.
This dude's about to invade me.
Look at all these horrible human rights abuses.
The Soviets are like, what the fuck, dude?
This is a situation getting out of control.
He was a child rapist.
So this all culminates in Black Hawk Down.
Italy went crazy over bananas in the 30s. So, like, they never heard of bananas.
You killed Naomi.
Ciao, mi chiamo Brace Belden e sono affiancato dal crudele e feroce tiranno Liz Franzak. Siamo raggiunti dal produttore Young Chomsky e questo è TrueAnon.
Buongiorno.
Mamma mia.
We are back. We didn't introduce this because we decided to name this kind of like a little series that I think we're going to keep returning to, like we said. But you came up with the name that I think is so great.
It's not, it wasn't that big of a reach. El Polpo.
Il Polpo, which means the octopus in Italian. Because, not just because kind of what we're talking about is very similar to the investigation into the octopus, but because similarly, it kind of drove us insane.
Yeah, and also it kind of has to do with fishing too. But
okay. Everyone, we're back.
Hello. There is kind of about every single part of this that we looked into, and we're still looking into. But like every part of this is like there's like a black cloud that hangs over all of it. Like,
you were saying
connects
that.
to like everything else.
Yeah.
It really, God, I guess what we have to do is just get some of the other stuff translated. But like there's so much shit in here that's like connected to, the 90s were like crime time.
Yeah.
Like everyone was like,
well, I mean, that's the thing. We were just talking about this before we started recording, is that like, and we touched on this in the last episode, but the fall of the Soviet Union is so crucial.
Soviet Union.
What?
Nothing. No, it's crucial.
Is so what? No, in this story, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
like, so many people were either getting the fuck out of there and trying to figure out how to make money, or selling off everything they could as stuff was falling apart.
Or going the fuck in there and trying to make money. Yeah, I mean, The 90s.
We haven't even talked about the Balkans.
No, and we'll touch on the Balkans like briefly here. We'll like graze the
that's
Balkans
another
briefly. And we
situation.
grazed it briefly in the last episode, I feel like,
We
too.
did, but this, Yugoslavia also is sort of looming large in this story.
Yeah, war and money and guns and drugs and toxic waste and the governments of most countries.
Seems like all.
Well, like some countries like don't really have enough money to have their government go other places.
But let's start with Italy.
So, 1990s in Italy, they were tough, frankly. The 1980s in Italy, also pretty tough. 1970s in Italy, tough as well. 1960s, pretty tough. 1950s, really tough. 1940s, well, famously not so hot. 1930, Italy didn't have a great 20th century.
No,
And it wasn't really around that long prior to the 20th century either. Italy is kind of really, when was the golden age of Italy?
don't look into that, Reese.
Was it? Do you think it was the 20s?
Let's focus on the 90s.
Wow. So the years of lead had finally ended. Unfortunately, the mafia wars were going crazy.
Yeah.
Falcone, and again, this is we talk about this in our episodes with, what are they again?
269, 270.
With Matt from Ghost Stories: The End of the World. But Falcone gets blown up in Palermo. I've been to the spot. And the Italian government was it was in the beginning stages of the clean hands scandal, which exposed the rampant, like almost mind-bogglingly large corruption endemic to the entire Italian political system.
Yeah.
Which the response to that was just basically like, what if we just do it for real this time with way more even openly corrupt guys, and at least we'll have bunga bunga parties. Things are falling apart in Italy. And in fact,
also, a lot of the Gladio investigations are just starting to get going, which is breaking everyone's brains.
Yes.
Because there is a kind of reckoning happening where everyone sort of thought things were going on in under very different circumstances.
Yeah.
And what the unraveling of the Gladio operation showed was that it was, everyone was being gaslit.
Yeah, and I think
From
a lot
top
of
to
people.
bottom.
There'd been evidence of Gladio stuff. There had been, exposés about P2, the secret hidden Masonic lodge of these various military, political, fascist figures.
Mm-hmm.
There had been, we've talked about this numerous times on the show, but all of this stuff, it was a great time to be a prosecutor in Italy, or a bad time because you could also get blown the fuck up, as many did. But Italy was just a fucking mess. And it's funny, in Illaria Alpi, in her last interview, and really one of the last conversations probably the last conversation ever recorded with her voice in it, she's talking to the Sultan of Bosaso, and she's referencing, and both of them reference, Italy is kind of racked with scandals right now, and there's this sort of this reckoning happening, and the Sultan is like, you should send some of those prosecutors down here. But we talked about the collapse of Somalia as a functional country with the civil war that engulfed the country in the early 1990s. I want to talk a little bit more about the early 1990s U.S. intervention into the country.
Yeah.
Because it gives us a little bit more, but in this episode, it builds up a little bit of a base.
Right. We talked about Black Hawk Down, but there's some broader stuff we kind of need to get into.
So, reiterate, the U.S.-led mission was ostensibly a humanitarian mission at first. The government had completely collapsed. All these different warring fiefdoms controlled much of the country. It was not governed in any coherent, centralized fashion. The war had immediately destroyed the agricultural sector. In fact, had destroyed most of the economy. The ports were closed to regular trade. Not to all trade, but to regular trade. Battles took place along overland transport routes.
Everyone was trying to get control of what they could.
Exactly. Part of the North broke off, forming the still unrecognized Republic of Somaliland. Although Trump, I think, by the time this comes out, whatever, but like a couple days ago from right this second, was talking about recognizing
Are you
it as
serious?
a country. Yeah. Who knows, though? Some of the rebels, which was the United Somali Congress, which was led by a trio of opposing factions, including an Italian-based faction, had taken the capital and kicked out Bari, but they immediately began infighting with Aidid, who had talked about quite a bit in our previous episode, and a guy named Ali Mahdi Muhammad, or Ali Mahdi as he's usually called, leading two of the major factions. Unfortunately, I found out that Ali Mahdi, he was like the president of Somalia during this time, but he died of complications relating to the virus known as COVID-19 a few years ago in exile. It's actually like a ton more complicated. We are not doing a whole episode about the civil war in Somalia, which is still technically ongoing. Although we will talk about more later developments in probably later episodes. But there are various reconciliations, deconciliations, counterattacks, attacks. The country is it's what it is, war torn. If a country was ever war torn, and at this point, the country is awash in arms. 64% of Somalis have at least one gun. So Ali Mahdi is the nominal president of Somalia. Whatever that means.
But whatever that means, there's no central government.
There's nothing to speak of. He controls parts of Mogadishu, basically.
Yes.
I think it's from 91 to 93 that he's technically in charge. Maybe a little later, but not super important necessarily to most of this. The thing that is important is that a ton of civilians are killed.
Yeah.
In the fighting, the various rebel groups, and then eventually the various warring warlords. And the place is starving. So the UN Security Council unanimously passes Resolution 751, which establishes a security force and also establishes an arms embargo. It would take a second to put UN forces together. So the U.S. is again, like we said in the last episode, we're ready to rock right now. Desert Storm was great. Got it done in about a week.
You don't order us around. We're going in.
It's funny. The U.S., I was actually, I think it was in some interview that I read, but Bush lands the troops in Mogadishu in December. And they thought they would be done by the end of January.
Dude, that's great. Desert Storm didn't go that great.
It was pretty quick. Weirdly enough, one of the Marines that made it to Somalia was Hussein Farah Aidid, the son of Muhammad Farah Aidid, who had gone to college in the U.S., joined the Marines, and fought in Desert Storm, and was now being deployed in the same task force that was trying to kill his father. Very strange.
That's strange.
The day the U.S. lands, the Italians are like, wait, hold on. The U.S. are going into Somalia? We love Somalia. We are going in too. They deploy that night. So they're like, okay, well, the U.S. is already in there. We got to get in there too. Honestly, there remains some confusion as exactly the real concrete reasons the Italians went into Somalia. Now, with UN interventions, sometimes guys are like, we'll do it. Yeah. But
the willing.
The willing. Coalitions of the willing. But there's not really a coherent explanation besides just we're going to do it. Because they don't get along with anybody else, any of the rest of the UN force, pretty much from the get-go.
Okay.
And contra much of what their government and army had been doing to their own people for the past 30 years, and what they would also do to Somalis, they were just what are we doing here? Why are we there's no clear mission. The U.S. is in charge here, but they're kind of just killing a bunch of people. We don't really know what we're doing. What the fuck is going on here? So they're backed up also by the Pakistanis, the Canadians, the Germans more. The Canadians do a bunch of war crimes. Somehow, obviously, mysteriously, this war-torn, fucked up, horrible, bombs going off everywhere, fires going off everywhere, completely destabilized country, gets more destabilized when the UN comes in. Funny how that happens. One of the major incidents, besides the Battle of Checkpoint Pasta and Black Hawk Down incident, was the Bloody Monday raid, where the U.S. helicopters massacre a bunch of civilian, religious, and political figures and members of a deeds group from the air. So they basically, this is pretty common with like the U.S. UN forces, is they just like go in and it's kind of free fire zones wherever, and like helicopters just like fucking open up. You know, funnily enough, I read in an interview with Thomas Montgomery, the U.S. commander in Somalia, that he says many of the Rangers think that the Italians were giving ID'd information.
So I want to pause here for a second because we should make a little callback to our previous episode where we talked about the rumors of a man named Giancarlo Marocchino who was potentially supplying ID'd militias with weapons.
Not only that, but was potentially stockpiling weapons of his own, was maybe getting some weapons from the Italian government or from the Italian army that they were confiscating from ID that he was selling back to ID. It's a little hazy to exactly what was going on there. But he's a guy with a warehouse in Mogadishu that had a lot of guns and he was Italian. I think that's
And a lot of contacts.
And a lot of contacts in the country.
Big Rolodex.
So the Bloody Monday massacre, a bunch of foreign journalists are taken to the scene and then are lynched essentially by the crowd. Like, people are like, you know, all these white men in helicopters just came and blew up like all these religious leaders in a fucking helicopter in this fucking house. And then you have these like white people coming down. They're like, oh, I'm going to take a picture of it. And people are like, we're going to fucking kill you. One of the journalists that gets killed is a guy named Dan Eldon who took, and it took me a second to find this picture because it was kind of hard to look it up. And all of this like stock imagery came up. But if you Google the picture, U.S. Marine disarming 15-year-old Somalia, I mean, I think both of you guys should do it right now. So actually, if you search for you have to search for a U.S. Marine disarming 15-year-old Somalia, Dan Eldon, and you'll find a picture of a U.S. Marine holding a pistol to the forehead of a Somali 15-year-old. That guy also gets killed, the guy who took that picture. It is a fucking insane picture. I'm not saying that he's guilty and should have been killed. That's not the implication there. It's just it's a picture that I've always, I saw a long time ago and I've remembered for years. It's just, Jesus Christ. But the raid and the massacre is a huge deal. In fact, it inspires Sherrod Brown,
former U.S. Senator
Sherrod Brown, to sponsor legislation to get the U.S. out of Somalia. And all these fractures that had been starting to appear in the UN coalition really coalesce with that because everyone's like, this probably wasn't good for the mission here. Like, I'm not sure what this has to do with delivering aid or disarming
Well, that's the whole
anybody.
story was the story with Somalia is that everyone was like, there was this whole moment where suddenly we didn't know what we were doing there after all.
It's like, I think you knew what you were doing. You were in a helicopter shooting missiles at people.
Yeah.
And it seems like that was the mission, if that's what you were doing. It actually leads to an insane situation where Boutros Ghali fires the UN guy, fires the Italian general leading the Italian mission because he's like, what the fuck is going on? And like, that's not what you're like, you can't do that. Like, that's like obviously like not the way that things are supposed to go. He doesn't like call him and tell him that. He goes on TV and gives a press conference and saying, you're fired. I'm Boutros Ghali.
Yeah, he embarrasses him.
So the U.S. gets out and the Italians and the Germans like the next day are like, we're fucking out of here too. And they split. It was a fucking mess. And amongst all of this, Illaria, Alpi, and Miran, Hrovatin return to Somalia for, I think, the 7th time to cover this withdrawal. So we need to talk about who these people were.
Yes. Finally.
So Illaria Alpi was born in May of 1961 or 1962. There's multiple different sources. I'm going to say 62. Yeah, 62. Her father was a fairly prominent urologist and a member of the Communist Party of Italy. She had an early knack for languages, majoring in Arabic, both the language, and she also She also majored in I think Arab literature. Like, she got really into that. She ended up speaking a number of different languages. She started work in journalism and was sent to Cairo, working for a couple of newspapers before winning a job at RAI, the Italian state broadcaster. So within RAI, she's given a job with the investigative division called Telegiornal 3. And she's sent all over. She goes to France, she goes to Belgrade, Morocco, and finally Somalia, where, again, she goes 7 times. She was working alongside her cameraman, Miran Hrovatin, from Trieste, who had cut his teeth as a war correspondent in the Balkans. Now, that is a little bit important because as part of the cover-up, or as part of the, response to these deaths, Hrovatin was smeared a little bit by saying that he was going on vacation to Somalia.
That was the same thing they did to Alpi, too.
Yeah.
And it's funny, by all accounts, Illaria was a very, dogged investigative reporter and was a very, very well respected by her colleagues, all of these things. And they kind of portrayed her as we're going to talk about, in the ensuing cover up response, whatever we want to call it, as kind of flighty, ditzy, kind of being stupid and careless, as if she being a woman, she didn't understand being in a conflict zone.
Absolutely, yes.
And with Miran, it was kind of the same, where they were well, they'd just come back from Yugoslavia, needed to get out, wanted the beach, didn't understand the situation. And that's just not true.
Hrovatin wasn't her usual cameraman either. She tended to work with other ones, but obviously they knew each other pretty well. And they're in Somalia for one last job to cover the withdrawal of Italian troops from the country. So they arrived in country on March 12th, 1994. And spend the first few days engaged in relatively normal work, following the Italian army, checking out hospitals, interviewing doctors, etc.
So they get to Mogadishu and they are immediately told by basically military escorts that the city is getting really bad. The situation is getting pretty dire. The Italians at this point had fully abandoned the north of the city and were in the process of evacuating the embassy. So when we say the Italians are leaving Somalia, that's what that entails, right? They're literally getting up and going. And by all accounts, the situation is a bit fraught. They are advised to stay at a hotel in the south. It's called the Hotel Sahafi. I'm going to keep referring to that in the future, so make a note of it. At the Sahafi, there is a big presence of foreign journalists. CNN is there, and the hotel has satellite access. So a lot of journalists like staying there because, one, it was in the south, which was a lot safer than the north, which was a little bit more volatile. And they were able to, make satellite phone calls to their newsroom, call in reports in the day, which is really important to the story. Yeah,
that's a hugely important thing, I guess, at this time in journalism to begin with, is actually being able to get a connection to file.
Yes. It's crazy how we used to do things, huh?
Uh-huh.
Now, some journalists weren't there. They were staying under the protection of a man named Giancarlo. I wrote his name down wrong here. Marancini. We're going to, you know what? Maybe it's just a name that we keep saying how we want, or we just call him Giancarlo.
Or we can call him the Moroccan, because Giancarlo is referred to as the Moroccan. Again, not Moroccan, Italian.
How about I call him Giancarlo and you call him the Moroccan? Because I feel like the Moroccan is very spy coded, whereas I can do a little flourish on Giancarlo.
Okay, you can just call him Giancarlo.
That'll help it with clarity.
Yeah, no, it's good. to
that'll help with clarity. If we call the same guy by two.
No, it'd be great because then we can just
names.
interrupt each other and say the other name, and it'll be cute for.
That'll actually make people understand it more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Giancarlo. Again, we're going to talk about him more in a little bit, but he, as the kind of mover and shaker in North Mogadishu, and remember we mentioned the weapons depot that he had.
Depots.
He was always kind of offering security services, and foreign journalists needed security. you could not go through Mogadishu without transport that was, like at least 2 security guards and a driver everywhere you went. And some of the hotels were not as safe as others. And Giancarlo would often say that, foreign journalists, just come stay with me in my compound next to all of my weapons and you'll be safe. And so he was offering those kind of services.
And to call back to the first episode, the Battle of Checkpoint Pasta, where the Italians had a giant, gun battle with Aidid's men.
Yeah.
Obviously, there is some allegations that some of those men were rearming and sort of like resupplying at the Moroccan,
Giancarlo,
his warehouses, and maybe even firing from them. Now, Giancarlo later, when he's being asked about this, is like, listen, some of my guys there, they heard that Italians were killing, Somalis, and I couldn't stop them. They just went crazy. They had to go fight people. What could I do? But he seems to have a lot of armed men in his employ.
Yes.
And, functions as, among other things, perhaps a bit of a fixer for journalists here.
For reasons we don't know, Illaria didn't want to stay with Giancarlo, which I think is important to point out. So she and Miran are stationed at the Hotel Sahafi. But they don't want to stay in Mogadishu for the whole trip. We mentioned they want to go up north, up the coast, to a town called Bosaso. There, they want to interview the Sultan of Bosaso, a.k.a. Bagor, a.k.a. King Kong,
a.k.a. Ismail Bagor, a.k.a. Abdullah Hagi Muse. So something I've talked to 3 Somalis about this. The reason that every Somali that we talk about has a bunch of names is because you kind of get nicknames a lot. And so people will get nicknames and be referred to that sometimes even in official settings here. King Kong sounds a little bit like Vice style. We met General Dick Sucker or whatever. No, I don't mean any disrespect to the Sultan of Bosaso. So I feel a little rough calling him that, but I assume but Bagor probably means something because I thought, listen, I don't speak the fucking language.
Yeah.
I had to run some of these names by people. I thought I was figure out this one guy's name, just how to pronounce it. And I found a different guy we'll talk about later. His name, it just means big nose. And so I'm like, oh, that's not even his name. So I think we should just call him the Sultan of Bosaso. Bagor.
Okay, so we've already said there's so many unanswered questions in this story, but it includes the timeline here. We know that Illaria and Miran depart Mogadishu for Bosaso on the 14th of March.
So to keep in mind here, Mogadishu is way at the south of the country.
Yes.
Bosaso is literally at the north of the country. It's far. It's not like they
have to fly.
They popped over to the suburbs for a cuppa. They went far as fuck to get there.
Yeah, it's a couple hour flight, I believe. Yeah. So they depart for Bosaso on the 14th, but what happens over the course of the next couple days before their return to Mogadishu is a bit unclear. So I'm trying to walk through this as much as we can. Illaria and Miran head up to Bosaso, way in the north. There had recently been a bunch of battles between different factions in the city, and aid workers had to temporarily leave. But in the same week that Alpi returned to Africa, the aid workers were returning to Bosaso. That's important to note because a lot of what we understand occurred over those days that Illaria and Miran were in Bosaso comes from the aid workers that they were kind of in contact with.
Yes. So there were ongoing fights in Bosaso between various parties and clans, even Islamic fundamentalist groups, which were trying to return to the area after getting pushed out in 1992. Because, there's a port there.
Yes.
There's a strategically important port in Bosaso that everybody kind of wants access to. Now, Bosaso is mentioned in the 1993 article in the Washington Post, titled The Italian Connection, How Rome Helped Ruin Somalia, as the site of a couple of Italy's biggest kind of scam development projects in Somalia. So, as mentioned in the first episode, The Italian state was basically like one big kickback project for the various political parties and the mafias they were all connected to. In the case of Somalia, the Socialist Party got that was like their territory, like their turf. Like, we're going to do all of like the development kickback projects there. So there is a highway that leads from Bosaso that cost $250 million to build.
We talked about it in the last episode.
Talked about it in the last episode,
Yes.
and we'll talk about it some more too, because it plays into a lot of things here. So there's that big highway, but there's also a port that the Italians built, but I maybe didn't finish building, although I've seen pictures of it. I mean, it seems, it's not a huge port, but there's a small port in Bosaso that the Italians built. The other thing that the Italians did, alongside building that port, was provided a small fishing fleet. So I want you guys all to just put a pin in this. It's March 14th, 1994. Illaria, Alpi, and Miran, Hrovatin are in Bosaso. They're interviewing a bunch of people there. They're spending some time with the Sultan. They're
taking
interviewing him.
video
They're taking
of the
video.
coastline. Very important.
And I want you to know, like, that's the timeline, the main timeline that we are being forced to diverge from here. Because unfortunately, that small fishing fleet plays a big role in all of this.